I want to introduce the student who will introduce to you our next candidate, Andrew Yang. I want to invite Sonali Mirpuri, who is a senior here at Georgetown.
Good morning. My name is Sonali Mirpuri, and I'm a senior in the Georgetown College studying history and government with a minor in education. For the last 3 years, I have been a student volunteer with the Institute for Politics and Public Service. While here, I co-founded Identity with Cynthia Sun, a fellow Georgetown senior. Identity is a dialogue series aimed at promoting the engagement and discourse surrounding the intersection of identity and politics. I also created and organized the Women of Color in Politics networking event that allowed young Hoyas of any background to meet and connect with professional women of color in politics. Today, I have the honor to introduce Andrew Yang. Andrew was born in upstate New York in 1975. The son of Taiwanese immigrants, Andrew studied economics and political science at Brown University prior to receiving his law degree from Columbia University. Andrew has dedicated his life to serving communities hit hard by the financial crisis. He is the founder of Venture for America, an organization that helps entrepreneurs create jobs in cities like Baltimore, Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Yang to the stage.
Top team.
Well, you didn't body surf, but that was pretty good.
Yeah, how you doing, brother?
Good to see you, Andrew. Good to see
All's
you.
well? Yeah.
All right, good. Thank you for joining me. I was about to say Andrew Yang does well with the students. And part of why you do well with students is because these folks here are not encumbered with all the reasons why things can't work. And you come out with bold ideas and bold statements. But you've been criticized for one of your bold statements about climate. And I want to just ask you about this. Did you mean what you said, or would you say it differently? You said, we like to act as if we're 100%. Even if we were to curb our emissions dramatically, the Earth is going to get warmer. The last 4 years have been the 4 warmest years in history. Here's the part that some people didn't like. We're too late. We're 10 years too late. You believe it?
How many of you all watched the Democratic debate in Detroit? It's the one before this last one. That's Georgetown for you. So we're familiar with the two main positions on climate change. The Democratic position, we have to fight climate change. The denialist position, climate change is a hoax and we don't need to worry about it. At that debate, I staked out the new third position, which is it's even worse than you think. And I'll stand by the fact that we are too late to curb some of the warming that we're seeing around the country and the world right now. I mean,
the world will warm.
The world will warm. Greenland just came out with a study saying that their ice pack is melting at the rate projected in 2070 today. And we are only 15% of the world's emissions. So even if we were to get our acts together very, very quickly, we would still be facing some of the disastrous impacts of climate change. Now, this is not to say I don't want to make big moves in the right direction. There's a proverb that says the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is now. We should have been doing this work 20 years ago, but the second best time is now.
So, Andrew, my producer's going to get mad at me. I don't know if that camera can get the pin that you're wearing, but you like to say this. It looks like you, and it's got a cap, and it says math, M-A-T-H. Andrew likes to say he likes math, but actually that stands for Make Americans Think Harder.
Yeah, Make America Think Harder, which is what we need to do, right, Georgetown? Yes. Thank you.
But this is the topic. This is the topic that both one has to think hard about, because climate means a lot of things to a lot of people. Warming means a lot of things to a lot of people. But at the same time, your job, and something you have tried to do with very complicated issues, is make it accessible to people who understand that climate change is a real threat, but they're not sure who's supposed to fix it, what they're supposed to do about it, and where it's going to get paid for. So how do you approach climate? Easy or hard to think about?
Well, the trap that Democrats are in particular where climate change is concerned, is that for a significant proportion of Americans, they hear fight climate change, and they think my life's going to get more expensive, things are going to get more inconvenient, I may lose my job if I work in an industry that could be impacted. So that is the tension that we have to alleviate from Americans and let them know, look, this does not have to be a matter of cost and inconvenience. We can actually create hundreds of thousands of opportunities around the country if we make the right moves towards a sustainable economy. Now, part of this is a measurement problem, where we have this GDP measurement that is now leading us off a cliff. GDP is at record highs in this country, also at record highs, stress, drug overdoses, suicides, financial insecurity, and our life expectancy has been declining for the last 3 years in a row. First time in 100 years. Last time it happened was the Spanish flu of 1918. So what we have to do is we have to modernize our measurements so that we're not in this tug of war with the other side where we're going around and we're being presented as the scolds who want you to, use a different straw or something like that. That's not the discussion that we want to be in with the American people. What we have to say is, look, we've been subsidizing fossil fuel companies to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars since day one. And now we're going to have a new industrial policy that moves us towards wind energy, solar panels. When I was in New Hampshire, so politician-y of me, I know, but when I was in New Hampshire this last trip, Ned Reynolds is an entrepreneur who now runs a company that has 260 employees, most of whom are installing solar panels on people's roofs. So that is the positive vision we have to present to the American people and say this is a win-win-win. And we can't get caught in this tug of war that's based in large part around a very narrow definition of economic value.
So part of the difficulty with that, as we have seen with coal, is that we understand that there is a day in which we will not use coal, and we've actually been going toward that, but nobody actually did anything for those people who work in coal. And in fossil fuels in general, those people who you might call frontline workers or people who have pizza parlors and car dealerships in places that are oil communities, they're going to look at the coal people and say, this is how we're going to end up if you vote for Andrew Yang or a Democrat. We're going to end up with broken towns and opioid addictions and no jobs and things like that. So how do you talk to people who do think that it's not just about straws, it's about airplanes and it's about cows and it's about ice cream and all that kind of stuff? How do you say this is actually opportunity, but we'll figure out a way that you share in that opportunity?
I spent 7 years working in the Midwest and the South primarily, and I saw the aftermath of the loss of manufacturing jobs, which is very much parallel to the loss of coal mining jobs. Correct. And you're right that these communities in many cases never recovered. That's why our life expectancy is declining, is that so many parts of this country now feel adrift. The big move we have to make is we have to start viewing people as having intrinsic value independent of the market. So if the market says, hey, as a coal miner, you used to be worth $45,000 a year, but now the mine closed, now you're worth zero. And then we all say, well, maybe we can train that coal miner to become a coder or something, frankly, quite ridiculous. And the only reason why you would even think that for a moment is if you've been brainwashed to think that economic value and human value are the same things, and that if you've lost your market value, then we have to move heaven and earth to find a new slot for you in the market economy. So that's the big progression we have to make. And as you all know, if you've heard anything about my campaign, you know I want to give every American $1,000 a month starting at age 18.
So the guy in the second row right there is very interested.
Oh. And for the students here, you get it. I mean, I get it. How expensive is Georgetown nowadays? I heard 77, and that's crazy, but it sounds like that might be accurate. So let's say let's say it's 70. I mean, 70,000 a year, it's over $250,000. I'm a parent, I've got 2 kids. And so you're looking up saying, like, how the heck did college become so unaffordable? How many of you all have taken out student loans? Now, Georgetown's pretty good, too, because Georgetown, but there are people watching this at other college campuses, also have massive student loan debts. And what we do is we've set up an economy that's not going to work well for you, and the institutions have just become so expensive and self-serving. So again, it's a function of seeing ourselves as inputs into the market. And then you see these colleges and say, well, you cost this much, and so I need to get a job that looks like that has this sort of paycheck associated with it. This is the big progression, where if we get the boot off of our throats, then the people who are in these towns that might be fearing for their place in the 21st century economy, if they start seeing that we'll all be able to share the gains through a dividend of $1,000 a month for starters, but then we have to build a new human-centered economy on top of that, then that's a vision that I believe that they're willing to accept and embrace. And I'm not saying this speculatively. I've actually been around the country now for 18 months, and I've worked in these communities for 7 years. So Americans are smart. Like, they see what's going on around us, and then if you pitch them on a vision that includes them, they'll actually listen.
What does climate change mean to you? What do you think is going to happen in this world in 2050 or beyond if we stay on the road that we're on right now?
Well, we can see the effects already. We're seeing coastal flooding in parts of the country and non-coastal flooding in the Midwest, in Iowa and Nebraska. We're seeing more and more powerful storms that are being driven by warmer oceans. We're seeing 4 to 8% of the Atlantic Ocean's biomass disappear every year, which is eventually going to be an epic disaster for us all. When I was in New Hampshire last month, there was a multi-million-dollar shrimping business that went to zero. And you can imagine the effect that's having on communities. So the effects are real, they're already happening. And if you can imagine all of those turned up dramatically, that is what our world will look like if we don't take dramatic action.
You have said that you like the Green New Deal. You got some problems with the timeline. You think it's too aggressive. Now, you painted a picture of a world that could be very dangerous, even if we do things. The world is still going to warm. So talk to me about what your issue is with the timelines of the Green New Deal.
I love the Green New Deal. I think they did us all a tremendous service by presenting a real vision for where we have to go. We are a very, very energy-intensive society. We consume a lot. And I'm more optimistic and confident that we can make progress on a slightly longer timeline that would be minimally disruptive to people's lives if we make the right moves on the way.
What's the disruption that worries you? What's the thing that you think would be better to do over a longer timeline?
Well, if you look at our modern lifestyle, I mean, there are a lot of things that we do that we don't even notice that are significant in terms of the energy consumption. And the Green New Deal's timeline, in my mind, would end up making some of those activities much more difficult really in the next 5 years, 5 to 10 years. I mean, the Green New Deal's original timeline, I believe, was around that. It's like 11 or 12 years, right. I believe. Yeah.
All right, let's talk about one of the things that you propose in your climate plan, and that is to increase the amount of energy produced by nuclear power in this country. An increase from where we are now. We've not had a meaningful expansion in nuclear power. Some people have criticized that too. Talk to me about that.
Well, again, we consume a lot of energy in this country, and if you're in a crisis, which we're in the midst of, then you have to consider a lot of options, really almost every option that's on the table. And nuclear energy, I'm happy to say they're working on next generation reactors that are cleaner, safer. They use material that's not intrinsically radioactive, like thorium is not radioactive in the same way that uranium is. It also cannot be made into weapons, so that's a plus. It degrades faster. So there are things that are nearing readiness for prime time that could be massive game changers for the composition of our energy consumption. And to me, it would be irresponsible if you are a leader and manager not to consider every option.
So the nearing ready for prime time, this is an interesting discussion, because if you become the president of the United States, obviously it's going to be important for people to understand how you conceive of climate change, and you've articulated that really well. And then you've got to do something about it. And there's a short-term and immediate bunch of things you can do about it, probably the low-hanging fruit.
Yes.
And then there's long-term. Tell me what your short-term and your long-term things that you'd actually do, as opposed to what you think needs to be done. What would Andrew Yang, as president, facilitate in terms of combating climate change?
How many of you all studied economics? I bet it's a popular major here. So if you study economics, you know that one of the biggest problems is economic externalities, where someone's not paying the cost. And the biggest externality facing us right now is carbon emissions. If I'm a company and I pollute, that doesn't cost me, that costs everyone. So one of the big moves we have to make, in my view, is to actually price in that externality. I'm for a carbon fee, a carbon tax and dividend, and then use that money to start moving us towards renewable and sustainable sources of energy. If you have a price on carbon and then you ratchet up that price progressively, then you'll see a lot of these companies invest meaningfully in reducing their emissions in a way that they don't right now because the money's not in it.
So I'll just stop you for a second, because you obviously have thought about economic issues a lot and in great detail, and you've written a lot about them. For people who are watching this who haven't thought that through or don't know how that works, how does that happen? Does that mean everybody gets to emit a certain amount of carbon, and beyond that you have to buy credits, or you just pay for the amount of carbon that you're emitting all the time, which forces you to actually reduce it?
So we would have pricing, the carbon fee initially would be $40 a ton. So it's immediate, and if you're emitting anywhere from a ton up, then you start paying into the system. But then you have an economic incentive immediately to try and reduce those emissions, try and streamline your operations so that they're cleaner, more sustainable.
And you would do this, you become president, and maybe you don't have a compliant Congress. How do you get this done?
Well, I'm happy to say that a carbon fee and dividend is a bipartisan idea. There are many Republicans that are behind it. It came this close to passing, even in this Congress, which is really saying something. With this president, it came this close. So as president, I believe that we can get that through, because this is something that even industry leaders have been calling for at this point.
All right, so I interrupted you. Tell me about the other things that you think you would do fairly immediately.
The other thing, and I talked about our economic measurements. So right now we have this GDP measurement that we made up 100 years ago, and it's leading us in the wrong directions. So as your president, I'm just going to go down the street to the Bureau of Economic Analysis and say, hey, GDP, 100 years old, kind of out of date. Let's modernize it and include things like our children's health and success, which is tied to climate change. Clean air and clean water, obviously tied to our environment. Our health and life expectancy, tied to climate change. Mental health and freedom from substance abuse. All the things that we care about, we actually make the new measurements of economic progress. And while this sounds almost too good to be true, it's very straightforward. You don't even need Congress for this. You have the Bureau of Economic Analysis, they have their measurements. You say, guess what? New measurement, American scorecard includes these things. And this way we can actually put environmental sustainability into our actual quote unquote GDP measurement. Now, this is something you can do very, very quickly, and it's very powerful, because you can't make progress if you don't have a baseline. And right now, we have 3 measurements for our economic progress if you turn on CNBC and the rest of it. It's GDP, which again is going the opposite direction of life expectancy, so which do you listen to? Stock market prices, which correspond to the fortunes of the top 20% of Americans, and headline unemployment rate, which is grossly misleading because it does not include people that are dropping out of the workforce, or people who are discouraged, or underemployed, or doing gig work. And so these 3 numbers are giving us a falsely positive impression of how we're doing. If you dig a little bit deeper, you start finding all of the problems. And so as president, I would update our measurements. And this would have a huge effect on us being able to make progress on climate change.
Because you'd suddenly see something different. Right now you have the president coming out and touting unemployment numbers,
yep.
Stock market performance, and GDP. So if a Martian showed up and said, oh, these are your measurements, you're doing very, very well. You're saying change how we look at how we are doing as a society and an economy, and suddenly we'll get a different reading and we'll say, we're in trouble?
Yeah, exactly. Where right now, if you were to have pipes that are poisoning kids, that actually shows up positively in GDP, because then you have to spend money on demolishing the pipes. And
hurricanes show up positively in GDP.
Hurricane shows up positively in GDP.
Because you're rebuilding everything.
Now, so think about how messed up that is. You're just like, oh, GDP went up. Well, why? Because we had to rebuild the town? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So you should actually have measurements that have hurricanes as very, very bad, have poisoning kids as extraordinarily disastrous, to the point where then it actually pays for you to make sure you have clean water. I mean, what's more expensive? New pipes or poisoning our kids?
Right. We don't measure poisoning our kids.
But we don't measure poisoning our kids.
Yeah.
That's right. That is the problem.
Carbon capture. David Wallace Wells, who's written extensively about this, has said that if you were to figure out how to, not figure out, but if you were to build the factories that you needed, the machinery to capture carbon, you need to build a facility every I may be making this up, but it's something like every hour for the next 78 years or something like this. This is really big. You've talked about carbon sequestration. You've talked about carbon capture. You've talked about something called cloud seeding. You've talked about putting mirrors in the sky. On one hand, that is big, bold thinking that I'm sure a lot of students will appreciate. On the other hand, Brian Kahn of Gizmodo has said it's a cavalier approach to a monster of a problem with tricky solutions and trade-offs, and there are questions about equity left largely unanswered that could pose a huge risk to society. About your big, bold thinking. Now, this is an issue with being Andrew Yang because you've got big you've got big issues, right? You've got big top. I don't mean you have big issues. No. He doesn't have big issues. You tackle big issues in complicated ways. How do you answer the question that, look, we've really got these problems to solve. You're talking about untested, risky theories. We're burning the earth.
Well, the simplest way to increase the level of carbon we capture is to plant more trees. And I think most everyone can get on board with that. So I would want to reforest vast tracts of land, including tracts of land that are not here in the United States. You can go to another country and say, hey, guess what? We'd love for you to plant some trees. We'll pay for it. We'll pay you to maintain the giant new forest over time. That's something very concrete, in large part because carbon capture is an energy-intensive process on its own, in its own way. And so that, it's more plausible to plant lots and lots of new trees than to create a new carbon capture facility every hour, as is being suggested.
Years, yeah.
And I suggest this planting trees that I think people get attracted to the whiz-bang stuff that might be on like my laundry list, but I'm a practical man. It's a lot easier to plant trees than to get mirrors into the sky. About issues with equity, I mean, we're in like the most inequitable society in the history of the world right now, and we're in the midst of the biggest geoengineering project in the history of the world right now. It's just the most haphazard, arbitrary, disastrous version of geoengineering, which is climate change. And so if you're in this sort of crisis, to me, the equity issues, and this is it's all tied together. It's all tied together. How many of you would agree with this statement? Americans have gotten less reasonable, less rational, less optimistic, and more subject to bad ideas in the last 20 years. So majority of hands are up. Now, the reason why that feels like the case is because we have introduced record levels of financial insecurity into our population. And studies have shown that if you cannot pay your bills, your bandwidth gets constrained cognitively because you're just trying to figure out how to make ends meet. And it has the functional impact of reducing your IQ by 13 points, or 1 standard deviation. So if you have the feeling that our fellow citizens are getting less reasonable, less rational, less optimistic, and more subject to bad ideas, they are, because that is exactly what you would expect if you can't pay your bills in a country where 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck and almost half can't afford an unexpected $400 bill. So what we do is we get the boot off their throat economically. We say, look, you're the citizen of the richest, most advanced economy in the history of the world. Here's a $1,000 dividend for you and your child. And then all of a sudden, they'd become much more reasonable, rational. If you say, hey, climate change is real, they'll be like, oh yeah, I really need to worry about that. Because you can't worry about a problem that seems like it's years away if you can't pay next month's rent. So what we have to do is we have to get people's heads up. And this is the equity issue is actually driving our dysfunction on climate change. It's all tied together. So when you talk about the inequities of some of my climate change suggestions, I'm actually on the opposite extreme, where I want to address the real pervasive inequities in our society right now that are holding us back.
So that's interesting. You're saying it's a cause and effect situation. If we know what percentage of Americans don't have $400 in case there was a disaster. We saw this with
47%.
We saw this with the government shutdown, right? Government workers who you're not supposed to think of as impoverished and in difficult times were not able to meet their bills in a 1-month government shutdown. So you're saying that if people can get just a little distant from their immediate financial struggle, then climate change stops, or their contribution to solving climate change stops being an abstraction to them. It becomes real and something that they can participate in.
Yes, and their future becomes clearer to them. Because instead of thinking about next week or next month, they're actually thinking about 5, 10 years from now, and that their child's future becomes assured, and thus something they have to be more concerned about.
So I'm curious, because you have built so much of your campaign around the idea of inequity, which is not just an American problem. Income and wealth inequality is a global and growing problem. We happen to be leading the trend here in the United States. Where does climate change as a critical matter fit for you in this? In other words, if you have a bunch of buckets of things that Andrew Yang thinks are really, really important, needs to be solved, is climate change at the top of that list?
Climate change is at the top of that list. It's the clearest existential threat to our way of life and our entire species. So you'd have to have it as threat 1A. To me, the reason why I'm known more for being concerned about automation of jobs, artificial intelligence, technology, is that I do think that they're very, very much tied together. To me, 1A is climate change, and then 1B is economic inequities that are turning us against each other, that are about to accelerate and take off. That we're not going to be a country that can counteract climate change if we're rioting because robot trucks took our jobs. I mean, like, we have to address the problems that will actually help energize solutions for climate change and other massive problems. And right now we're polarized, we're divided, we have this dysfunctional government up the way, in large part because this country has gotten hived off into different types of economic enclaves. I was staggered by the experience of just flying between St. Louis and San Francisco, or Michigan and Manhattan. You feel like you're traversing dimensions or decades and ways of life instead of just a couple of time zones. And as long as that remains true, it's going to be very, very hard to build consensus around the biggest problems we're facing.
Let's take it out to the crowd. I want to go to Iowa State University. We have a student there with a question. Tell us who you are and your question, please. We have a student there with a question. Tell us who you are and your question, please.
Hi, my name is Jean-Luc Devay. I'm a senior in public horticulture. And so my main question is, as the planet has gotten warmer, we are now entering into a new stage in a new world, and I'm wondering how you would implement both better and both advocate for advancing and surviving into this new wild world that we're not quite used to yet.
Oh, is that live? Can I say hello to you? Do you see me?
Yes, I can actually see you.
Oh, that's funny. I'm coming your way.
It's a good thing that was live.
Oh, good thing. I've definitely talked to recordings. It's happened. That is the question, is how are we going to prepare our planet, our society, to actually work for you all and for young people? And right now we have set you all up with a total disaster that you're inheriting, and then sometimes we blamed you for it. We've said it's somehow your fault, which makes no sense in my mind. Climate change is the most dramatic, but there's also the economic inequities, gun control, and the fact we can't get our acts together on that. There are so many problems that you all are inheriting, and we have to fix them for you. We have to get it working for you. Climate change is going to be this series of natural disasters around the country that are going to be ongoing. And we know who suffers most in natural disasters. It's people with lower levels of resources, who tend to be black people and people of color, people that don't have robust shelters to go to, or even cars to get into to drive away. So we need to literally and figuratively move our people to higher ground. And for anyone who thinks that's overly dramatic, we're actually already relocating climate refugees in Louisiana, like out of one part of the country to another part that's more inhabitable. So my plan, I have a 5-point plan to address climate change that includes tens of billions of dollars to help make communities more resilient, but also to help citizens actually relocate if that's something that they're open to doing.
Right, and are you talking about, look, millions and millions of people? I think about 120 million people in this country live in flood-prone areas in terms of coastal areas. We're not talking about the Midwest flooding. What mechanisms exist to disincentivize people from living there, from continuing to develop in places that are going to be flood-prone? Is that just going to be the market, or are you going to do something active to say, guys, we need to live in different places, or we need to live in different kinds of homes?
Well, there is at least one home that the government has paid to rebuild 36 times, which to me strikes me as like a poor use of resources. Like, you could literally build a much nicer house just about anywhere else in the country for the same amount of resources. So we have to try and steer the market towards more long-term environments and solutions. I'm not someone who would ever try and pull the rug out from an American homeowner, but we have to put the right incentives in place. I'm much more about putting positive incentives in place than the negative. So you would want to work with the insurance companies to say, look, if you're in this flood-prone area, and right now you're sticking it to homeowners at that level, maybe there's something else we can do.
So you got a small disagreement with the Green New Deal in terms of schedule. It's not that big a deal. Most Democratic candidates share the view that it's somewhere between now and 2050, things that we're doing are going to have to be completely done, if not well on the way. We have an administrator of the EPA who does not share your view. The current administrator of the EPA says this is not urgent. It's 50 to 75 years away.
So
I mean, this is the government of the United States of America, Andrew Yang.
Oh my gosh! Don't remind us.
This is an issue. I mean, we have people who are in governmental positions in this country, many of whom have been influenced by work in the fossil fuel lobby, who are peddling a myth that this is not a today thing. I think everybody here and everybody in one of those colleges that we have cameras in that are connected to this forum understand. Put up your hand. This is a today thing?
Yeah, it's a today thing.
It's a today thing.
Yesterday thing. It's a 10, 20 year ago thing.
That's a big. What do you do when you get in? Does this become is this an empowered EPA or an empowered Department of Energy or an all-of-government solution or a climate czar? What's the thing that it looks like to you to make sure that everybody understands that this is an emergency?
Well, first you'd appoint a head of an EPA that believes in the EPA, believes in climate change. I mean, that's day one. Have a Secretary of Energy that has the same vision that I have, that our new leadership will have about where we need to go. I think a climate change czar is a good idea. Maybe Jay Inslee, I'm sure he'd love that role. But the fact that our current government is so out to lunch on this is just a sign of institutional decay and deterioration. And that's, I mean, the institutions have been decaying for a while. That's how Donald Trump got into office. And the fact that now we have leaders of our government signaling something that the rest of the civilized world knows is false, as painful as it is, it's not that surprising.
Let's go to a question up there on the balcony.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Are you live? I'm kidding.
That's an avatar, Andrew.
My name is Julianne. I am in the college here. I'm a junior. And my question was about human rights because I'm skipping my human rights class to be here. My question is, some people argue that the environmental crisis won't be solved with just America because we don't account for all of the world's emissions. In my opinion, I think that climate change can start by being solved with us because we're a world leader and people will follow in our lead. But what do you think is the degree that framing environmental rights as human rights instead of perhaps like just an economic incentive is a good strategy to like unify the global community?
It's a great question, and you're entitled to a note from either of us to your human rights professor.
She learned more about human rights in this auditorium. I'm kidding.
It's a great question.
It is a great question, and one way we address that and make it a human right is have a constitutional amendment to safeguard our environment, which is what I'm proposing. So if you can imagine that being a new part of our Constitution, then that would be a very powerful signal to other countries around the world that this needs to be something that we're all working on together. Now, if the rest of the world is 85% of the world's emissions, which they are, right now China is selling or even giving coal-burning power plants to Africa and other developing countries and saying, hey, great news. And so if you want that still developing country to not use that plant and use solar panels and wind turbines, you have to make it, frankly, cost competitive for them. This isn't a moral leadership thing. This is an economics thing. Because if you're a developing community in Africa and you just want to get the energy as inexpensively as possible. So we have to lead through our own constitution and our morals, but we also have to go to that country and say, look, don't burn the coal. We've got these awesome solar panels. We'll make this a no-brainer for you. And that's going to be a massive investment on our part. But that is the investment we 100% should make as the United States.
And just to be clear, what you are proposing from a constitutional amendment perspective, is a green amendment that would require states to commit to protect, preserve, and improve the environment. So you are prepared to embody this in the Constitution of the United States as a right.
Yes, because what are we doing for our children and our young people if we're leaving them a shambles of a planet and a climate? So to me, that should be embedded in the Constitution, and that's the message we should send.
Mo?
So as you know, we received emails from students of all over and one of them, John Michael Murray, who's getting his master's in environmental management at Yale, writes, Mr. Yang, unlike some of the other frontrunners, you have been supportive of the expansion of nuclear power. Why do you think nuclear should be a part of the future energy mix, and why do you think the other frontrunners are making a mistake in counting it out?
You know, I spoke about this a little bit earlier, that there are next generation nuclear reactors built around thorium instead of uranium that have a world of potential to produce sustainable energy. I do not know why other candidates are shying away from nuclear. I mean, other countries have been using nuclear power successfully for a number of years to reduce their emissions. So you'll have to talk to the other candidates. Maybe they're just not as forward-thinking as this one. Not kidding. But to me, it's the responsibility of a leader and manager to consider every available alternative, and nuclear is one of the more viable ones if we can alleviate some of the problems.
So you think about big ideas. How do you think about these moonshot type of things, right? Whether it's the mirrors, whether it's thorium, whether it's carbon capture. Who would you turn to for that? Because this is government level, industrial level, moonshot type of thinking, right? You've got to commit to the idea that the Earth is going to warm even if we do the right things. So we have to do more than the right things. We've got to have technologically, scientifically advanced ways of doing things. You're the opposite of a science denier.
Well, yeah, I love science. It's right next to my math hat, the science hat. So we have to stop thinking that if we do less of the bad, it's going to work. We have to do more of the good, which is what you're describing, Ali. So we need to reforest, we need to reseed our oceans. And you talk about who I'm going to get to work on it. You all saw I was endorsed by Elon Musk just a few weeks ago. And I know for a fact Elon wants to work on this.
Does that follow with a thing about how we're all going to drive electric cars?
Because they're awesome. We should drive electric cars.
All right, I want to go up to USC. We've got a student out there. Please tell us who you are.
Hi, my name is Adam Jackman, and I'm a freshman political science student at the University of Southern California. And my question for you is, how can we work with corporations to fight climate change, and how, as President of the United States, will you incentivize them to do so?
Thank you. I sense a political future in your future. Companies can be trusted to do the right thing for their bottom line. That is the only thing they can be trusted for, truly. They have really a singular incentive. And so the way to get them engaged on climate change is to tie their profitability to their sustainability. And again, that sounds very difficult, but a lot of my campaign is built around updating our economic measurements. And one of the elements of my plan is for large companies to actually have to measure their emissions and then not just pay a carbon tax, but also take into account their impact on people aside from their shareholders. So we have to get over this fact that somehow companies are going to do the right thing because they're nice guys or gals. That's just not the way our system works. Our system is designed to optimize for one variable, and that's profitability and stock market price growth. So if you're going to want them to move in the right direction on climate, you have to hit them where it hurts, which is in their wallet, their bank account.
So if you're talking about, go ahead, you can applause.
And
you can applause.
And I don't want to make that seem negative too. It's like we can like give them where they love it in their bank accounts if they do a good job.
But if I'm a
That phrase has never been used before in human history and will never be used again.
if I'm an oil company executive listening to you, I'm hearing two things. You're going to put a tax on carbon. I'm hearing three things. You're going to put a tax on carbon. You're going to end all the subsidies that I get. And now you're going to tie my business to damage it may do. You're going to measure the damage it may do to non-shareholders, i.e. the earth or people who get asthma or whatever the case is. So that, at that point, my business model doesn't work. Not drilling for oil and not fracking for gas. It doesn't work.
I think your business model works just fine based upon your current multi-billion-dollar profitability. And if you have to invest some of those billions of dollars in some of the energy sources of the future, that's what you should be doing. You should have done that decades ago if you had your acts together. So, don't cry me a river.
So do you see past 2050? What role will fossil fuels have? Will there be gas stations? Will there be airplanes running with fuel? Will there be cars with internal combustion engines? Will there be some version of that, just smaller, or none?
Oh, this is a challenge that companies in every industry face at various points. I mean, you can see companies that are investing in products that they know are going to displace them. So will these companies manage to evolve with the times? I hope so. I do. And they're among the best situated to make some of the investments that we need for the future. Do I think that we're going to be burning fossil fuels at gas stations in the same way we do now in 2050? I really hope we do not. I hope that that's a charging station. I hope that you only have to use it every so often and that we're in clean cars. We might not even own our cars at that point. I mean, these business models are going to change a lot. And as a country, we cannot get stuck saying that, well, this is the way it is now, so we have to stick with it. We have to get with the program and move towards the future.
Right over here, sir.
Hi, I'm Cliff. I'm a sophomore here at Georgetown.
I see you got dressed up, Cliff.
Yeah. Well, you're not wearing a tie, so.
Touche.
Oh, snap. Cliff gets as long as he wants.
I'm studying philosophy and government, and my question is a little bit tied to the last one, actually. It's as a candidate who's heavily emphasized the role of entrepreneurship and private industry as part of the solution to the climate crisis, how much of the government's role in that solution do you think should involve regulatory action and sort of trying to keep private industry in check, versus how do you think the government can help leaders like your supporter Elon Musk build environmentally conscious businesses?
So it's a really good way to parse that issue. You talked about you liking positive incentives more than negative incentives, but this future involves both.
We've been subsidizing these fossil fuel companies for decades to the tune of tens, hundreds of billions of dollars. So we can't pretend that we're not already an active player. We are. So we have to take those incentives and move them towards sustainable sources of energy. The government's role in many ways is to set the stage and get the incentives right. And then if they do that well, then entrepreneurs and industry and the private sector can then figure out the best path to address those goals. And that's a vision that I share with many innovators, where you don't expect the government to be the source of all the innovation, though the government should be funding basic research that right now is not commercially that viable. But the private sector should be taking it from there. And using Elon Musk as another example, I mean, his companies are based upon technology in some cases that was subsidized by the government, in the case of electric cars, and technology that has been developed by the public sector. And this is our freaking real life Iron Man, you know what I mean? Like, and he's very open about it. He's like, sure, like there were subsidies involved. There have to be. The government has to put the incentives in place. But the biggest misconception is that it's not something that we already do, because we've done it for the fossil fuel companies. We just need to do it now for the electric, the solar, the wind companies, and everyone else.
So you have this ability to envision the future, right? With your proposals on universal basic income, you've played the whole chess game out, and you see what it looks like on the other end. Play the chess game out on climate change, the positive incentives, the regulation that Cliff was just talking about, the reduction of our weaning off fossil fuels and eliminating them possibly. What does that look like to you? What does the world look like to you in 2050? What physically do you think we will do differently than we do today that will result in us fighting climate change?
Well, I mentioned before that we might not own our own cars. Our current car ownership and usage model is really inefficient and bad for the environment. So you might have a society, you guys all probably agree with this because you're quite young. When I was your age, I was like a car, like having that car was such a big deal. I was driving like a 1985 Honda Accord that could like barely get up hills. And I was like, yeah, and I was like rolling the window down like this. So what we're really selling is not the car, it's mobility. And so if you have mobility that's then tied into a much more, if you had like, for example, this constant roving fleet of electric cars that you would just order up, then you could diminish the impact of ground transportation on our environment very, very quickly. So that's a very, very clear one. You have to look at what the source of emissions are right now. I mean, there are models about some of the buildings that they're developing that are more energy efficient, the LEED buildings. There was one piece I read about multi-story wood buildings, which struck me as so cool that apparently wood can be a legitimate building material for even like 10, 12-story buildings that they don't like burn, like as you'd think they might like, be ultra flammable or something like that, like they're not. So they're, now no one wants to get into the wood skyscraper thanks to Andrew Yang, I'm sorry. So these are some of the investments that we can make that would actually not just make our world more sustainable, but also more practical, usable, and beautiful. Over here.
Hi, my name is Laya Rajan. I'm an MD PhD student here at Georgetown. My question is, how do you plan to increase science literacy amongst Americans such that everyone buys into the idea that it's important to contribute to combating climate change?
It's a massive challenge for us to move our country forward in a way that we can all agree upon by the facts. Because at this point, we don't even agree on basic facts. Part of this is the media silos we operate in. Part of it is the institutional mistrust that is built up. Where I think right now Congress has a national approval rating of 12% or something along those lines. And you could say, well, maybe they've earned that. But if you're an American in another part of the country, and then I say, hey, I represent the government, you're like, yeah, the government is full of it. And if I say, hey, the government is proposing something like climate change and science and whatnot, then they mistrust it. Now, one of the things that helps reconstitute trust is when you have a lower stress level, when you actually feel like, and we've seen this in the studies when people have frankly received universal basic income, is that their actual trust in each other goes up. What's beating us right now is this mindset of scarcity that, in my opinion, is also fueling skepticism in science. If you replace that with a mindset of abundance and possibility, which you can't do entirely, but you can certainly reverse the dominance of scarcity and make it more balanced, then you can increase people's acceptance of science.
So this is key to something we were discussing earlier. The scarcity feeds the idea that fighting climate change is a sacrifice and a cost on a personal and a business level, a cost to your prosperity. Abundance feeds a very different way of looking at it. It becomes possibly opportunity for you, possibly job growth, possibly prosperity, and some sense of contribution to solving a problem that is facing us all.
That's exactly right, Ali. You summed it up. We need to instill a mindset of abundance in this country in order to solve the big problems. And right now, it's slipping away. Scarcity is winning in this country by the numbers. If you were born in the 1990s, you have a 50-50 chance of doing better than your parents. In the 1940s, that was a 93% chance. So you can see the trend. It's heading in the wrong direction. And that's why people feel the way they do. Sir.
Good morning. My name is Mateo Caulfield. I'm studying government in the college at Georgetown University. My question is, if extensive regulations were put in place to prevent climate change, there would inevitably be a resulting increase in unemployment. How would your policy proposals aid the transition from a fossil fuel economy to one that is powered by renewable energy without losing jobs?
So this is the transition, and again, we're subsidizing the fossil fuel companies to tens of billions. So if you put tens of billions into renewable energy companies, you could create the jobs very, very quickly, like Ned Reynolds' company in New Hampshire that employs hundreds of solar panel installers. The problem is that the jobs will probably be in different places for different people than the fossil fuel jobs, and the government is not great at doing like a one-to-one. And so you would need to have at least some of the money set aside for meaningful transitions and grants for affected and displaced workers. One of the stats that I find most troubling right now is that Americans are moving across state lines at multi-decade lows. And so instead of moving for a new opportunity in, let's say, like a green energy economy, people are staying where they are, and then their way of life is deteriorating and not improving. So we need to help people move. We need to say, look, if you're going to lose your fracking job, then we need to be able to get you from where that job is to where a green job is and not just count on you to do it yourself.
You've put a lot of thought into this idea because of your work on universal basic income and AI and robotics, what we call the fourth industrial revolution. And the fears that we have visceral fears about job displacement because of the last industrial revolution. And you've sort of thought about this. This idea of changing our economy around climate is not dissimilar to the fact that our economy and these jobs are going to change anyway.
Yes. They're very much, again, tied together. But we are in the midst of the greatest economic transformation in the history of our country. It's what got Donald Trump into office. We automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Iowa, all the swing states he needed to win. And now we're doing the same things to retail jobs and call center jobs and truck driving jobs. So that's why the scarcity is so powerful. That's why people are afraid for their jobs, right, is because they sense that we have machines and technology that can do many of those jobs more inexpensively.
Hi, I'm Madison Dyer. I'm a sophomore at Georgetown studying healthcare management. And my question was, realistically, the only way to curb expansion and reduce the environmental impact of the cattle industry is to reduce demand. What policy adjustments would you make to reduce this demand?
I'm glad you asked that because we wanted to talk about food and the rate at which agriculture, not everybody thinks about this, is a major contributor to CO2.
Now, cattle is very energy consuming and energy expensive. And if you project forward on what we would need to do to reduce emissions, you would want to modify Americans' diets over time. Now, some of that is happening naturally through education. I do think it's difficult to regulate diets. So what you would want to do, again, is you'd want those cattle producers to have to internalize the cost of emissions. Because if your cattle ends up polluting a lot, which they do just naturally, we don't hate them for it. I mean, they're just big animals. Don't hate the cattle, hate them, whatever. So then what that would naturally do, and some people are going to hate this, but it would probably make those products more expensive. And that is appropriate because there's a cost to producing food in that way. And so if you were to make it more expensive, then you would end up changing consumption patterns over time.
Which does speak to your whole issue, though, of how do you mitigate for that for the people who are least able to affect it. So when you talk about people who live in coastal areas, people who live in places that flood, people who can't afford their groceries, it's many of the same communities around the country. So if we're talking about making food expensive and housing expensive and insurance expensive, how do you offset that?
Well, as you know, Ali, my plan is to give $1,000 a month to every American adult. So all of the things we're talking about are going to be much less impactful than $12,000 a year or $24,000 a year if there are 2 adults in your household.
All right. Sir.
My name is Michael Tan. I'm a master's student studying physiology here at Georgetown. I don't consider myself an expert in policy or environmental science, but from what I can tell, any significant and meaningful reduction in CO2 emissions will require coordination with other high-emission countries like China and India. Yep. Does your administration plan to address this, and if so, how do you plan to hold these countries accountable to actually reducing their output?
That is the question that, in my mind, should be at the forefront of any real approach to mitigating the worst effects of climate change. China and India, massive populations, growing economies, and huge carbon and environmental footprints. So the way I would lead, one, we have to get our own acts together. It's very hard to say, do this if you're not doing it. So that's job one. A constitutional amendment, I would convene a global summit on this. And right now what China's doing is China's making progress on renewables and then exporting the dirty energy. And so again, we have to go globally compete with them and say, look, we need to be exporting the clean energy. Most of the country is just operating on their own well-being. If you go to other countries and say, do the right thing, it probably will not be effective. I would rejoin the Paris Accords immediately. I mean, dropping out was obviously the wrong move. But then we have to actually take it a step further, because a lot of the Paris Accords, even if you agreed to it, there's not a whole lot of enforcement built into the Paris Accords, let's put it that way. So if you could get some of the big polluters aligned and then say, like, this is something we all have to try and solve for, then you can try and change the incentives for countries that are earlier in their development.
Excellent. You talked about about American leadership in this. We have moved away from it entirely. It's going to take a little bit of effort to get America to be taken seriously in the world on this one. We were already having difficulty because of the preponderance of climate deniers in this country, and now we've got no official leadership on this issue in the world.
Well, the great thing is that in our national politics, the pendulum tends to swing from one extreme to the other. So you have Donald Trump, and the rest of the world is like, what is going on with America? They like drop out of the Paris Accords, they're like entirely backwards. And then you end up with President Yang. And then the rest of the world will be like, wow, America got its act together very, very quickly.
This is the guy who is sitting right there who seemed very interested in the $1,000 a month.
Please pick my family. My name is Jameson Smith. I'm from Myrtle. I'm sorry, I'm nervous. I'm a sophomore in the college. I study environmental biology. So with climate change being something that we can agree on being like a thing, right? It makes hurricanes, for example, worse, like more damaging. It's not necessarily more hurricanes, but the impact is like larger. I'm from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, so like I see these effects firsthand. And like people are losing homes, like their whole livelihoods, like people are like dying and being displaced. And I understand what you're saying with like, yeah, like money's a thing, but like money can't buy hope. So outside of money, how else do you plan to help these people that do live in coastal areas?
It's the question. So money is the foundation. What you do is you get the boot off of people's throats and you say, look, basic needs, ability to protect yourself and your family should be assured. And then we have a new human-centered economy that's built around people's health and well-being and mental health and resilience. And that would naturally end up supercharging the resources that are being directed that right now we're not even measuring the impact of. And so that's the vision. The other thing is if you're in a truly coastal flood-prone area, then I have a tens of billions of dollar fund to both protect your community and help make it more resilient, and also provide resources for you to relocate if that's what you want. Most Americans do not want to move, and we should not be pitching to people, it's like, hey, you got to move. Like that's not a winner. But if someone is open to it, then we should have the incentives there for them to do so.
All right, you've got in your plan, you've got $40 billion allocated for relocation funds for coastal populations, $30 billion for flood protection like seawalls. So that'll go some distance. I've been in Myrtle Beach the last 2 years when hurricanes have hit. And that's, you know, when we always talk about why people don't leave these places, well, some people can't afford to leave these places and go fill up 2 extra tanks of gas, go stay in a motel for a week if they don't have family around. So that's a real valuable question. In the media, we get very caught up with why didn't you just leave? Well, some people, it's not a reality for them. Sir.
Hi, my name is Stephen Zhu, and I am a graduate student at GW. George Washington University. I have a quick question. So we know that you love electric vehicles and you think it's awesome. If you are the President of the United States, will you lead by example and order an electric presidential vehicle?
Whoa! Wow.
Yes, I will, and I'll go even better. The entire White House motor pool will be electric.
All right. And your faith is in the fact that electricity still has to be generated as a power source. You just believe that whether it's through your emphasis on nuclear, the lowering in the cost of solar and wind and hydroelectric, that we will be able to produce enough base electrical power to be powering all our cars, because we are the biggest consumers of gasoline for transportation in the world, right? We're 5% of the world's population, and we're a quarter of the world's oil consumption just for driving around.
Just for driving around. Yeah, I am confident. I mean, we have a chief, very obvious source of energy in the sun, and it produces plenty of energy that we could convert to electricity. The problem is more in the storage than the actual source. But our storage is getting better and better all the time, so I am confident, yes.
All right. Andrew, this has been a great discussion. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you to all of you.
Thank you, Georgetown! Thank you! I'm coming down!
Andrew Yang, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Andrew.
I'll come back this
We got
way.
a 15...
anticlimactic come back down the aisle.
Andrew's coming on back. We're going to be back in 15 minutes. So do what you got to do.
Thanks, guys.
And
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you.
I will be back with